The dawn broke reluctantly over the Crimean Peninsula in January 1942, pale winter light, filtering through wisps of morning fog that clung to the rugged terrain like spectral fingers. In the distance, barely audible at first, came the low rumble of steel wheels on railway tracks, a sound German sentries along the front lines had come to dread. For this was no ordinary train approaching. This was the Zheleznyakov, a Soviet armored train that had earned the fearful nickname Green Ghost among Wehrmacht forces for its devastating surprise attacks and seemingly supernatural ability to vanish before German artillery or aircraft could respond. The Germans had heard rumors of these Soviet monstrosities, rolling fortresses of steel and firepower that appeared without warning, unleashed hell upon their positions, then disappeared into the labyrinthine network of tunnels, cuttings and ravines that characterized the Crimean railway system. But nothing had prepared them for the psychological impact of facing these steel beasts in combat. The winter sun cast long shadows across the frozen landscape as Oberleutnant Kurt Meyer lowered his binoculars and swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. Through the morning haze, he could make out the unmistakable silhouette of the Soviet armored train, its camouflaged form almost blending with the surrounding rocky terrain, its gun turrets rotating methodically as it approached. Meyer had been with the 11th Army since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, witnessing firsthand the devastating power of German blitzkrieg tactics across the Russian steppes. But here in Crimea, where the fighting had devolved into a brutal slugfest for every meter of ground, the Germans were learning that the Soviet forces had weapons and tactics of their own that could strike terror into the hearts of even veteran Wehrmacht soldiers. The armored train was one such weapon, a relic of an earlier age of warfare that had found new purpose and deadly effectiveness in the unique conditions of the Eastern Front. The railway system that crisscrossed the Soviet Union was both its lifeline and, increasingly, a network for mobile artillery platforms that could strike with devastating force before retreating to safety. Meyer had heard the stories from other officers, tales of German units caught in the open by these steel monsters, cut to pieces by concentrated artillery fire from armored railway cars before they could even identify the direction of attack. The worst part was the helplessness. Conventional anti-tank weapons had limited effectiveness against the heavily armored trains, and calling in Luftwaffe strikes rarely succeeded before the trains slipped away into tunnels impervious to aerial bombardment. The Zheleznyakov was particularly feared, its dark green camouflage scheme blending perfectly with the Crimean vegetation, its crew of Black Sea Fleet sailors operating with a precision and ferocity that had earned them a fearsome reputation along the entire front. Meyer wiped sweat from his brow despite the bitter January cold. His men were scattered in shallow foxholes along the perimeter of a small village just 2 kilometers from the railway line. They had orders to hold this position, critical junction controlling access to the approach to Sevastopol, but Meyer knew their chances against an armored train were minimal at best. His company had one 50mm anti-tank gun, woefully inadequate against the train's armored plates, reinforced with concrete. The Zheleznyakov boasted 5 76.2mm guns, multiple machine guns, and mortar platforms that could saturate an area with devastating fire within seconds. More than the physical threat, however, was the psychological impact. German soldiers called it Eisenbahnangst, railway fear, the knowledge that at any moment, from any section of track within range, death could arrive on steel wheels with minimal warning. The guttural sound of the locomotive grew louder as the train approached. Meyer could see its features more clearly now. The main locomotive sheathed in armor plating, followed by a series of armored cars with gun turrets protruding from their reinforced sides. The most terrifying aspect wasn't the weapons themselves, but the methodical way they traversed, scanning for targets, the barrels tracking smoothly like the eyes of some mechanical predator searching for prey. The German advance into Soviet territory had been predicated on technological superiority, on the assumption that Soviet forces were poorly equipped and trained. Yet here was evidence to the contrary, a mobile fortress of sophisticated engineering that demonstrated the resourcefulness and adaptability of their enemy. The Soviets had taken a concept from the previous World War and transformed it into a modern weapon system perfectly suited to the conditions of the current conflict. Inside the Zheleznyakov, Commander Nikolai Alexandrov stood in the control car, surrounded by the rhythmic clanking of the armored train's wheels and the quiet efficiency of his crew. Most were sailors from the Black Sea Fleet, men who had traded the rolling decks of warships for the confined spaces of this land-bound vessel of steel. Yet they brought with them the discipline and gunnery skills of naval warfare, making the armored train function with the coordinated precision of a warship. Alexandrov studied the German positions through the armored viewport, his experienced eyes picking out machine gun nests, troop concentrations, and the telltale signs of an artillery position partially hidden in a copse of trees. The train had been in continuous operation for months now, conducting over 100 combat missions, destroying dozens of German strongpoints, and becoming a symbol of Soviet resistance during the desperate defense of Sevastopol. The German forces had tried everything to neutralize the threat of the Zheleznyakov. Luftwaffe bombers searched tirelessly for it. Artillery units had standing orders to prioritize the railway lines when the train was spotted, and special commando teams had been dispatched to sabotage tracks and set ambushes. Yet the Green Ghost continued to strike with impunity, exploiting the natural features of the Crimean landscape and the network of tunnels that provided sanctuary from air attacks. The train's crew had developed an almost supernatural sense for danger, knowing precisely when to advance and when to retreat, maximizing their impact while minimizing their vulnerability. They operated mostly at dawn or dusk, when visibility was poor, or during the night using intelligence provided by partisan units that reported German troop movements. Their appearances seemed random and unpredictable to the Germans, but were in fact carefully planned operations based on detailed knowledge of enemy dispositions. Alexandrov gave the order, and the Zheleznyakov slowed to a halt at a position offering clear fields of fire toward the German-occupied village. The gunners, already at their stations, made final adjustments to their aim, compensating for distance, wind, and the slight incline of the tracks. There was no need for lengthy explanations or detailed orders. The crew had performed this deadly ballet dozens of times before. A simple nod from Alexandrov was all it took. The first salvo erupted from the train's guns in a coordinated thunder of noise and flame, the shells arcing toward the German positions with mathematical precision. Within seconds, secondary explosions indicated direct hits on ammunition stores or fuel dumps. The methodical fire continued, each gun selecting targets according to pre-established priorities. Command posts first, then heavy weapons, then troop concentrations. In his foxhole, Meyer felt the ground shake as shells impacted nearby, showering him with frozen soil and melting snow. The air filled with the screams of wounded men and the acrid smell of explosives. His radio operator was frantically calling for artillery support or airstrikes, but Meyer knew it would come too late. The train would deliver its deadly cargo of shells and then disappear back into the maze of tunnels and cuttings before meaningful countermeasures could be organized. This was the maddening aspect of fighting against these armored trains. They dictated the terms of engagement, appearing from nowhere, striking with devastating effect, and vanishing before an effective response could be mounted. It violated everything the Germans understood about modern mechanized warfare, where mobility and concentration of force were supposed to be their advantages. The exchange of fire continued for 20 minutes, though to Meyer it seemed like hours. The German positions were systematically reduced, their return fire pinging harmlessly off the train's armored plates or falling short as the gunners struggled to find the range. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the bombardment ceased. Through the settling dust and smoke, Meyer saw the train begin to move again, picking up speed as it retreated along the tracks, disappearing around a bend in the railway line just as the distinctive sound of Luftwaffe engines became audible overhead. Too late. As always, pilots would report seeing nothing but empty tracks, perhaps catching a glimpse of the train as it entered the safety of a tunnel immune to their bombs. The Zheleznyakov had struck again and escaped unscathed, adding another successful mission to its growing legend. Back at German headquarters, Generaloberst Erich von Manstein studied the latest reports with growing frustration. The armored trains were becoming more than just a tactical nuisance. They were having a strategic impact on the campaign for Crimea. More concerning was their effect on morale. German soldiers spoke of the trains with a mixture of fear and grudging respect, attributing to them almost supernatural qualities. Some units had taken to posting dedicated lookouts with the sole responsibility of watching railway lines. Men who often exhibited symptoms of stress and sleep deprivation after days of staring at empty tracks in anticipation of the metal monsters that might appear at any moment. Von Manstein had requested specialized anti-train units equipped with heavy artillery that could penetrate the reinforced armor, but such resources were scarce, and priority was given to the main thrust toward Moscow and the oil fields in the south. The irony wasn't lost on the German high command. Their own military had experimented with armored trains before the war, but had largely abandoned them in favor of more mobile mechanized units. The prevailing wisdom was that trains, restricted to railways and vulnerable to air attack, were obsolete in modern warfare. Yet here on the Eastern Front, with its vast distances, harsh terrain, and extreme weather conditions, the Soviet armored trains were demonstrating a devastating effectiveness that forced a re-evaluation of this assumption. The Germans began to convert captured Soviet trains for their own use and to design new armored trains specifically for the conditions of the Eastern Front. They studied the tactics of the Soviet train commanders, learning from their enemies how to maximize the impact of these steel behemoths. Months passed and the siege of Sevastopol intensified. The Zheleznyakov continued its operations, though with increasing difficulty, as German forces adapted their tactics and concentrated anti-train measures along critical sections of the railway network. Air surveillance increased. Artillery was pre-sighted on vulnerable stretches of track, and special commando teams attempted to sabotage the rails or lay mines. Yet the Green Ghost seemed to lead a charmed existence, appearing where least expected, delivering its deadly cargo of shells, and disappearing before effective countermeasures could be deployed. The train had become more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of Soviet resistance, a mobile monument to the resourcefulness and determination of defenders fighting with their backs to the sea. On June 26, 1942, as the German offensive reached its climax, the Luftwaffe launched a concentrated attack on the tunnel system that had provided sanctuary for the Zheleznyakov throughout the siege. Over 50 bombers targeted the main Troitsky tunnel, their payloads designed to collapse the entrance and trap the armored train inside. The barrage was unprecedented in its intensity, the earth shaking with each impact as tons of explosives found their mark. When the dust settled, one entrance to the tunnel had indeed collapsed, but in a final act of defiance, the damaged Zheleznyakov emerged from the remaining exit, its guns blazing in one last attack against the encircling German forces. It was only after a second massive airstrike the following day, which sealed the remaining tunnel entrance, that the Green Ghost was finally neutralized, entombed in the darkness of its underground refuge. The fall of Sevastopol soon followed, but the legend of the Zheleznyakov lived on in the accounts of German soldiers who had faced it in combat. They spoke of its uncanny ability to appear and disappear at will, of its devastating firepower and seemingly impenetrable armor. In their stories, the train grew to mythical proportions, a steel specter that haunted the railways of Crimea and struck terror into the hearts of even the most seasoned Wehrmacht veterans. For the Soviet forces, the Zheleznyakov became a symbol of resistance against overwhelming odds, its crew exemplifying the courage and resourcefulness that would eventually turn the tide of war against the German invaders. In a conflict defined by massive tank battles and vast infantry engagements, it was somehow fitting that one of the most enduring legends would center on a weapon system that many had considered obsolete before the war began. Ironically, the Germans salvaged the Zheleznyakov from its tomb months later, rebuilding it and pressing it into service against its former masters as the armored train Eugen, armed with 105mm howitzers. It was as if they sought not only to utilize the train's physical capabilities, but also to capture some of the mystique that had made it such a formidable psychological weapon. But the magic couldn't be transferred. The German crew never achieved the same level of effectiveness or inspired the same fear as the original Soviet sailors who had earned the train its ghostly reputation. When Soviet forces retook Crimea in 1944, the Germans destroyed the train rather than let it fall back into Russian hands, a final acknowledgement of its significance as something more than mere machinery. The story of the Soviet armored trains reveals a fundamental truth about warfare. Adaptation often trumps technological superiority. The Germans had entered Russia with what they believed was the most advanced military machine in the world, only to find themselves confounded by weapons and tactics that exploited the unique conditions of the Eastern Front. The armored trains were perfect examples of this, taking an older concept and updating it for modern warfare, finding new relevance in the specific context of Russia's vast railway network and varied terrain. It was a lesson the Germans learned too late, as they struggled to counter these steel ghosts that materialized from the mist, wrought destruction, and vanished back into legend. Today, if you visit Sevastopol, you can find a monument to the Zheleznyakov, a restored locomotive with the proud inscription, "Death to Fascism," emblazoned on its side. It stands as a silent testimony to an era when massive steel beasts roamed the railways of Eastern Europe, striking terror into the hearts of those who heard their approach. The Green Ghost and its kin may have been consigned to history, but their legacy lives on in the stories of those who witnessed their deadly efficiency and in the military textbooks that study how an apparently obsolete weapon found new life and devastating purpose in the unique conditions of the Eastern Front. Perhaps there's a lesson here for all of us, that sometimes the most effective solutions aren't the most obvious or technologically advanced, but rather those that best adapt to the specific challenges at hand. As we stand at this monument to innovation and courage, let us remember the men who turned these steel machines into legends and changed the course of history through their resourcefulness and determination.